She was 23 years old, standing in the middle of a courthouse with her wrists tied together, and not a single person in that room thought she was worth saving. Her uncle had set the opening bid at $40. By the time it dropped to $5, people were laughing. By the time it hit nothing, not a cent, not a promise, not even a handshake, the laughter had turned into something crueler. Silence. The kind that told a person exactly what the world thought they were worth. Then the door opened, and Gideon Crow walked in. If you've ever watched a room full of people go completely still because one man entered it, you know what happened next? He didn't say a word. He walked to the front, picked up the pen, and signed his name. Then he took out his knife, not to threaten, not to posture, and cut the rope from her wrist like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Nobody laughed after that. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me because this is only the beginning. The trouble with Harlan Mercer was that he never knew when to stop. He'd been a gambler his whole life. Not the romantic kind you read about in dime novels. Not a man with quick hands and a sharper mind. Harlan was the other kind. The kind who chased bad luck with worse decisions, who borrowed money from men who didn't believe in forgiveness, and who had spent the better part of 30 years burning through everything that ever mattered to him. His farm was gone. His reputation in 2 counties was gone. His wife had died young, and some people said it was the grief, and some people said it was the shame, and nobody talked much about which was worse. What Harlan had left by the first week of November was his niece. Evelyn Mercer had come to live with her uncle when she was 9 years old, after her parents died of fever within a week of each other out on the Nebraska plains. She barely remembered the wagon ride to Harlan's farm in Deadwood Creek. She remembered the way his wife, Aunt Clara, had smelled of dried lavender and bread dough, and she remembered that for about 6 months she had felt something close to safe. Then Clara got sick, and after Clara, it was just Harlan and Evelyn and a farm that needed more work than one man with no commitment to hard labor was ever going to give it. She had kept that farm alive for 14 years. Not because anyone asked her to, not because Harlan thanked her or paid her or even noticed half of what she did. She got up before light, and she worked until her hands cracked and her back ached, and the stars came out again. And she did it because the alternative was watching everything her aunt had built get swallowed by weeds and debt. She did it because she didn't know what else to do. She did it because she was Evelyn Mercer, and she had been taking care of things nobody else wanted to take care of her whole life. Harlan lost the farm on a Thursday night in October. She didn't find out until the following Monday, when a man named Doyle showed up at the door with 2 other men behind him and a piece of paper in his hand. Evelyn had been making soap. She still had the smell of lye on her when Doyle told her she had 48 hours to clear out, and that if she gave them any trouble there were ways to make that happen faster. Harlan was in town, presumably losing something else. She packed what she could carry in a canvas bag: her mother's silver comb, a wool blanket, 3 changes of clothing, the seeds she'd been saving for spring, and she walked the 4 miles into Deadwood Creek in the rain. She found Harlan at Puddin's Saloon, which was what people called the back room of Clarence Puddin's dry goods store, where the legitimate commerce ended and the card games began. He was sitting at a corner table with 3 other men, and when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, soaking wet with a canvas bag on her shoulder, something moved across his face. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who has been caught and is already calculating how to talk his way out of it. "Evelyn," he said, "you look half drowned." "They came to the farm," she said, "Doyle and 2 other men, with papers." "Well," he picked up his cards again, "I was going to tell you." "Tell me what, Uncle Harlan?" "That things have gotten a bit complicated." She stood there in the doorway of Clarence Puddin's back room, rain dripping from her hair onto the floorboards, and she looked at the man who had been the only family she had for 14 years, and she understood, with the clear, cold clarity that comes when you have suspected something for a long time and finally stop pretending you haven't, that she was in serious trouble. The next morning, Harlan took her to the courthouse. He did not explain why on the walk over. He walked fast, and she had to work to keep up, and the few times she tried to ask him a question, he said, "Just come on," or "We'll get it sorted," or once, when she pushed harder, "Evelyn, would you please just for once in your life stop asking questions?" The courthouse was a 2-story building at the far end of Main Street, stone on the lower half and white-painted wood on the upper, with a flag that hung limp in the still November air. There were already people gathered out front when they arrived, which she didn't understand. She'd never seen a crowd at the courthouse before 8 in the morning. She understood when she got inside. The main room smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, and too many people standing too close together. There was a raised platform at the front, normally used for public proceedings, for land disputes, for the reading of official communications from the territorial government, and standing on the platform was a man she recognized as Everett Crane, who was not exactly a judge but served as one in Deadwood Creek because no actual judge had been willing to take up residence in a town this far from anything resembling civilization. Behind Everett Crane, seated at the long table, were 3 men she didn't know. And standing to the side, not quite meeting her eyes, was Harlan. "What is this?" she said. "Now, Evelyn." "What is this, Uncle Harlan?" He had owed money to a great many people. That was the thing she understood fully for the first time in those next few minutes, as Everett Crane explained the situation in the dry, detached tone of a man who has seen things like this before and has made his peace with the fact that the world is not a fair place. Harlan owed money to Doyle, who owned the farm now. He owed money to the men at the table, who were associates of a larger operation out of Cheyenne that Harlan had been gambling against for the better part of 2 years. The total figure was substantial. The total figure was, in fact, so substantial that Harlan had nothing left with which to pay it. "Nothing," Everett Crane said, "except the girl." She thought she had misunderstood. She stood very still, and she told herself she had misheard, that her ears had gone wrong somehow, that there was another explanation for why the room had gotten so quiet and why people were looking at her the way they were looking at her. Then Crane said, "Miss Mercer, your uncle has proposed the arrangement under Territorial Statute 14. Indenture by debt proxy. The value of your labor estimated over a period of—" "No," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Barely a word at all. "I'm afraid it's already—" "I said no." Louder this time. Loud enough that a few people near the back shifted. Harlan finally looked at her then, and she saw it. Not cruelty exactly, because she had never believed her uncle was a truly cruel man. What she saw was something worse. She saw the face of a man who was sorry, who genuinely regretted what he was doing, who had thought about it and done it anyway because his own survival had always mattered more than anything else. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said. "I don't have a choice." "You do," she said. "You're just not making it." Someone near the back of the room laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. They tied her wrists with rope, not because she was violent, not because she fought them, but because that was what the statute required, a visible binding to formalize the transaction. And then Everett Crane read the terms of the arrangement out loud in his flat, bureaucratic voice while the people of Deadwood Creek watched. She kept her eyes straight ahead. She had decided she was not going to cry. She had decided this the moment they put the rope on her wrists, because she understood instinctively that tears would be taken as confirmation of something, of helplessness, of weakness, of the idea that she was exactly the kind of person who ended up standing on a courthouse platform while strangers decided her fate. She was not going to give them that. She was going to stand straight and breathe and wait for whatever happened next, and she was going to be alive at the end of it. The bidding started at $40. Crane had explained that this figure represented the estimated annual value of domestic labor in the territory, which was how her uncle's debt was being reclassified. Not as a sale, because that would be illegal, but as an indenture. The legal distinction seemed to matter a great deal to the men doing the paperwork, and not at all to anyone else in the room. $40. Crane looked around the room. Nobody moved. 35. Still nothing. 20. Somewhere near the back, someone made a comment she couldn't hear clearly, but the laughter that followed was sharp and mean. She fixed her gaze on the far wall, on a water stain above the window that was shaped roughly like the state of Ohio, and she breathed. 15. 10. 5. One of the men at the table, a heavy-set man with a red beard, leaned over and said something to Crane in a low voice. Crane nodded, frowned, adjusted his papers. "We'll open the floor to any consideration," he said. "Any arrangement, any offer." Silence. Not the ordinary silence of a room waiting for something. A different kind. The kind that had weight to it. She could feel it pressing against her chest, could feel the specific texture of it, pity in some quarters, entertainment in others, and underneath everything, a fundamental indifference that was somehow worse than either. These people had known her for years. She had sold eggs to their families, had helped their wives put up vegetables in autumn, had attended their children's christenings and their parents' funerals. She had been here, in this town, being useful for 14 years. And not one of them moved. She heard her uncle clear his throat. She heard someone in the back say, "Shame that," without much conviction. She heard the wind pick up outside, rattling the courthouse windows, and she thought about her mother's silver comb in the canvas bag at her feet, and about the seeds she had been saving for spring, and about the fact that the spring planting wasn't going to happen now. None of it was going to happen, and all the winters she had survived to get to this moment. The door opened, not dramatically, not with a bang. It just opened the way doors open when someone decides to walk through them, and the cold air that came in with it moved through the room and made the lamp flames shiver. She didn't look right away. She had been staring at the Ohio-shaped water stain, and she kept staring at it because she was not going to flinch, was not going to react to every door and footstep and whispered comment. She was going to hold herself together. Then the room changed. She noticed it before she saw him. The particular shift that happens when everyone in a space redirects their attention to the same point. The murmuring stopped. The shuffling stopped. The man in the back who had been making comments to his neighbor went quiet. She felt the weight of the room's focus move like a tide, and she turned to see what had caused it. The man in the doorway was tall, not in the broad theatrical way of men who know they are being looked at, but functionally tall, the kind of tall that comes from years of doing physical work in large outdoor spaces. He wore a canvas coat with the collar turned up and a flat-brimmed hat that was dark with moisture, and there was mud on his boots from what looked like a hard morning's ride. He had a beard that hadn't been trimmed with any particular ambition, and a face that had been worked over by weather until it looked less like something that had grown and more like something that had been carved, angular and still, not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that made it difficult to look away. She didn't know him. She was certain of this. She had lived in Deadwood Creek and its surrounds for 14 years, and she knew every face in this room and most faces in this county, and she had never seen this man before. But the room knew him. She could tell by the way they had gone still. Whatever this man was, whatever history he carried with him, the people of Deadwood Creek had an opinion about it, and that opinion had just replaced every other thought in the room. He looked around slowly. His eyes moved across the crowd with the unhurried attention of a man surveying terrain, and when they reached the platform and found her, wrists bound, chin up, canvas bag at her feet, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. She was watching for pity, and it wasn't that. It was something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. Or a kind of quiet anger that he was keeping carefully below the surface. He walked to the front. The crowd parted for him without anyone saying anything, people simply stepping aside because it seemed like the natural thing to do. And he walked to the platform and stopped in front of Everett Crane and looked at the papers on the table. "This is the Mercer arrangement," he said. It wasn't a question. "It is," Crane said, and he had the careful voice of a man who is not sure what comes next. "I'll take it." A sound moved through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two, something with confusion in it, and something that might have been dark amusement. Someone said, "Crow?" He didn't respond to that. He picked up the pen from Crane's table, not waiting to be offered it, not asking permission, and he signed his name on the document in the flat, efficient handwriting of a man who does not consider penmanship to be a matter of great importance. Then he set the pen down and reached to his belt, and she saw the knife and she tensed. And then she understood what he was doing, and she stopped tensing, because he was not reaching for the knife to threaten anyone. He reached for it because there was a rope on her wrists, and ropes, apparently, were something he intended to do something about. "Hold on a moment," Crane started. "The arrangement's signed," the man, Crow, said. "The binding is unnecessary." He cut the rope in one clean motion. She felt it fall away from her wrists, felt the blood move back into her hands, and stood very still while the room watched, and nobody said anything. And Gideon Crow stepped back and looked at her. Not at her face, not appraisingly, but in the straightforward way of a man checking to see if a person is injured, and said, quietly enough that it barely carried past the two of them, "Can you walk?" Yes, she said. Then let's go. She picked up her canvas bag. She was aware, with the heightened sensitivity that comes from extreme stress, of every person in that room watching her move. She was aware of Harlan standing to the side, not looking at her now. She was aware of the man with the red beard at the table saying something to the man beside him. She was aware of a woman near the door, Martha Alcott, who had bought eggs from her every Tuesday for 6 years, looking at her with an expression that was half curiosity and half something that might, generously, be called sympathy. She walked through the room. Crow walked slightly ahead of her and slightly to the side, not touching her, not guiding her, just moving toward the door with the straightforward intention of a man who has decided to leave a place. The crowd gave way. Nobody said anything, not to her, not to him, not until she was nearly at the door and she heard someone, she didn't know who, say in a low voice to whoever was standing next to them, "Well, that's that then." She pushed through the door into the November air. It was cold, the kind of cold that comes down off the mountains in the first week of November and reminds the high plains that winter is not a suggestion. And she stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in and didn't allow herself to think about what had just happened or what was going to happen next. Because if she started doing either of those things, she was going to lose the composure she had been holding together with both hands for the past hour. Crow came out behind her. He stopped on the step beside her and looked out at Main Street, which was going on with its ordinary business. A wagon passing, 2 men talking outside the feed store, a dog sleeping in a patch of thin sunlight near the saloon. She turned to look at him. Up close, in daylight, she could see that he was older than he'd seemed inside. Mid-40s, maybe, possibly older, with deep lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. His hands, she noticed, were badly scarred across the knuckles and palms. Old scars, long-healed. "Who are you?" she asked. "Gideon Crow." He said it like it should mean something to her, then seemed to recognize that it didn't and didn't add anything further. "Where are you taking me?" He looked at her for a moment. "My place. Up the mountain." He paused. "You can see it first if you want, before you decide anything." She stared at him. "Before I decide anything." "The paper I signed is an indenture arrangement. Legally, you're contracted to me for a period." He said it with a kind of flat directness. No apology in it, but no satisfaction either. "But there are things that paper says and things it doesn't say. I don't intend to hold you to anything you're not willing to." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved down Main Street and lifted the dust at their feet. "Why?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not hostile. She actually wanted to know. Why had he walked into that courthouse? Why had he signed that paper? Why was he standing on these steps telling her she had choices, when the entire rest of her day had been spent being told she had none? He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't read, something old and private. And then he looked back at the street. "Because nobody else did," he said. His horse was tied at the post at the end of the street. A large gray animal with a dark mane, solid and calm, not pretty, but clearly capable. Crow untied her without ceremony and looked at the canvas bag in Evelyn's hands. "Is that everything you have?" "Yes." He nodded as though this information was neither surprising nor troubling, and tied her bag to the back of the saddle. He mounted, then looked back at her. "You ride. I can manage." He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment, a scarred, weathered hand with no particular grace to it, and then took it and let him pull her up behind him. She settled into the space behind the saddle, arranged herself as practically as possible, and tried to decide where to put her hands. She settled for gripping the back of the saddle rather than him. They rode out of Deadwood Creek without looking back. She did not allow herself to cry. Not on Main Street, where anyone could see. Not on the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land and the road north began its climb toward the foothills. Not for the first several miles, when the town disappeared behind a ridge and the silence of the high country opened up around them, and there was nothing to look at but bare cottonwoods and gray sky and the long brown grass bending in the wind. She cried at about the 4-mile mark, quietly, with her face turned away from the back of Gideon Crow's head. Not because she was frightened exactly, although she was. Not because of what had happened exactly, although that too. She cried because she was 23 years old and she had just spent 4 hours being publicly valued at nothing. And even though she had stood straight through all of it and kept her chin up and refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her break, there was a cost to that. There was always a cost. She cried for about 10 minutes, then she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and looked at the mountains ahead. They were large. That was her first coherent thought about them. Not poetic, not frightened, just registering the basic fact. She had seen the mountains all her life, from a distance, the way you see things that exist beyond the edge of your world. Up close, they were something else entirely. The foothills gave way to real elevation faster than she'd expected, the road narrowing as the grade steepened, the trees thickening from scrub and cottonwood to pine, the air sharpening until she could taste the cold in it. The light was different up here. It came through the pines at low angles and made long shadows across the snow that lay in patches under the trees. Crow rode without talking. She didn't try to make conversation. There was nothing to say that seemed adequate to the situation, and the silence wasn't unfriendly. It was just silence, the kind that exists between two people who don't yet know each other and aren't pretending otherwise. They rode for what she estimated was 3 hours, maybe 3.5. The last section of the climb was steep enough that she gripped the saddle harder than she'd intended, the horse picking its way carefully up a trail that was more suggestion than road, switchbacking through dense timber. Twice she heard water, a creek, somewhere below them, invisible in the trees. Then the trees opened. The cabin sat in a clearing at the base of a rock face. Not a large clearing, maybe 2 acres, sheltered on 3 sides by the ridge and the timber, open on the 4th to a view down the mountain that, even in November with the sky the color of old pewter, was the kind of view that stopped thought for a moment. The cabin itself was log construction, substantial, chinked carefully, with a covered porch along the front and a stone chimney on the near end. Behind it, connected by a short covered walkway, was what appeared to be a barn. There was a woodpile along the south wall that reached almost to the eaves. A serious woodpile, the kind a person builds when they know exactly how hard a winter can get. It was not pretty. It was functional and solid and clearly the work of someone who understood construction and took it seriously, and it had the particular look of a place that had been built for use rather than appearance. Crow dismounted and reached up to help her down. She took his hand and dropped to the ground and stood looking at the cabin while he led the horse toward the barn. "Take a look around if you want," he said over his shoulder. She stood in the yard for a moment, canvas bag in hand, and looked at the clearing. There was a kitchen garden along the east side of the cabin, winterized, the beds mounded and covered. The remains of what might have been a flower bed near the porch steps, not tended recently. A rain barrel with a board lid. A stack of fence rails along the tree line. A wheelbarrow turned upside down against the woodpile. She walked up the porch steps and put her hand on the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open. Okay. The inside of the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, visible through a gap in the ceiling boards, accessed by a ladder along the far wall. The main room held a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall, a table with 2 chairs, a workbench along the east wall covered in tools in various states of repair, shelves of provisions, and a narrow bed in the corner nearest the fireplace. It was clean, not tidy in the way of someone who cleaned for appearances, but genuinely clean. The floor swept, the dishes on the shelf wiped, no accumulation of the ordinary debris that builds up when a person stops caring about their space. It was also cold because there was no fire. She stood in the middle of the room and took stock. There was firewood in the box beside the hearth. There were provisions on the shelves. She could see flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, a crock of something she couldn't identify from a distance. On the workbench, among the tools, she could see a partially repaired leather harness and what looked like a disassembled rifle mechanism laid out on a cloth. She set her canvas bag on the table. Then she found the fire steel and flint on the mantel, where they should be, and she crouched in front of the fireplace and began laying a fire. She heard him come in when she was coaxing the first small flame into the kindling. He stopped in the doorway, and she was aware of him looking at her without saying anything for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's cold," she said. He came in and hung his coat on the hook beside the door and went to the workbench without further comment. She heard him pick up whatever he'd been working on. She fed the fire and the kindling caught, and she added progressively larger pieces of wood until the fireplace was doing what it was meant to do and the warmth began to move out into the cold room. They didn't speak again for almost an hour. Eventually, because there was no particular reason not to, she went to the shelves and found what was needed and started putting together a meal. She was not sure this was welcome. She was not sure of anything about this situation, but she was hungry. She suspected he was hungry, and cooking was something to do with her hands while she thought. She made corn porridge with dried salt pork, because that was what the provisions suggested, and because it was practical and hot and substantial. She found the bowls on the second shelf and the spoons in a tin box on the workbench, and she put it on the table when it was ready and sat down. He looked at the bowl for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "I used your provisions," she said. "I should have asked. You should have anything you need." He said it plainly, without ceremony. "While you're here." She ate. The porridge was not remarkable, but it was hot and there was plenty of it, and she was hungrier than she'd realized. Across the table, he ate in the unhurried way of a man who eats alone and has no habits around sharing a meal. After a while, she said, "I heard someone say your name back in town." He looked up. "Crow," she said, like it meant something. He went back to his bowl. "I grew up in this country. People have long memories. They were afraid of you." He didn't deny it. "Some people." "Should I be?" He looked at her again. The same direct look she'd noticed on the courthouse steps, the kind that assessed without performing. "That's for you to decide," he said. "I'm not going to tell you not to be. You don't know me." She thought about that for a moment. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said, "in the courthouse." "No. So why did you?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, and she was beginning to feel she'd pushed too far. That this was a man who had firm limits around what he would discuss, and she had found one. Then he said, "I came into town for supplies. I saw the notice posted outside the courthouse 3 days ago. I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I know what it is to have people decide what you're worth and be wrong about it." The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the pines in a sound like breathing. She looked at him across the table. This stranger with the scarred hands and the face carved by weather and the two-word answers. And she thought about a courthouse full of people who had known her for 14 years watching her stand there with rope on her wrists without moving, and about this man who had never met her walking through that door. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." He nodded, like this was acceptable, like it was a reasonable arrangement between two adults in an unreasonable situation. "The loft is yours. I sleep down here." She looked at the ladder, then at the narrow corner bed with its single blanket. "You don't have to. It's fine." He picked up his bowl and carried it to the wash basin. "I generally don't sleep much anyway." She carried her own bowl over, and for a moment they both stood at the wash basin in the small kitchen alcove, elbows almost touching, and the fire threw their shadows long across the floor. And it was the strangest moment of a very strange day. This ordinary domestic proximity, this complete absence of ceremony about what had happened and what had brought them here. "My name is Evelyn," she said. She realized they hadn't introduced themselves formally, that no one had introduced them. "I know," he said. "Gideon." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to the surface, but something moved at the corner of his mouth that had that direction, and then it was gone. She went to get her canvas bag and carry it up the loft ladder. The loft was small, barely room to stand with a sloped ceiling following the roof pitch, a straw tick mattress on a wooden frame, and a single wool blanket folded at the end. A small window in the gable end shuttered against the cold. She set her bag down on the floor, took out her wool blanket, and added it to the one already there. She could hear him moving around below, the sound of wood being added to the fire, the creak of the chair, then nothing. The cabin had gone quiet except for the fire and the wind. She lay down on the mattress fully dressed and looked at the ceiling, the rough underside of the roof boards, the pine knots, and the places where light had once leaked through before the chinking filled them. Her wrists were still faintly red from the rope. She rubbed them absently. She was in a cabin halfway up a mountain with a man she'd met 3 hours ago. She had no idea what tomorrow looked like, or the day after. She had nothing except what was in her canvas bag and whatever terms a legal document she hadn't read said about the arrangement she was now part of. But there was a fire in the hearth below, and the sound of it coming up through the floor was warm, and she was not tied, and she was not afraid. And those two facts, small as they were, seemed like something to hold on to. She thought about the water stain on the courthouse wall, the one shaped like Ohio. She thought about her mother's silver comb in her bag. She thought about the spring seeds still wrapped in cloth, which she had planted at farms across 3 counties for 14 years and never planted at a place that was truly hers. Then she stopped thinking and let the sound of the wind and the fire take over. And somewhere in there, without meaning to, she fell asleep. Below her, Gideon Crow sat in his chair by the fire and didn't sleep, which was nothing new. He stared at the flames and listened to the silence from the loft and thought about a courthouse full of people he'd been avoiding for years and what it had looked like. A young woman with her back straight and her chin up, standing there while the whole town decided she was worth nothing. He thought about what it cost a person to hold themselves that still while that was happening. He picked up the harness from the workbench and worked the leather in his hands without purpose, just something to do while the fire burned down and the wind worked through the pines and the night deepened around the cabin. He had lived alone on this mountain for 11 years. He had told himself and told himself again that it was what he wanted, that the solitude was a choice and not a sentence, that a man could decide deliberately, after enough loss, that the safest way to live was to live without anything left to lose. He was still working on believing that. The first week was the strangest week of Evelyn Mercer's life, and that was saying something, given the week that had preceded it. She woke before light each morning. Habit, 14 years of habit, and lay in the dark of the loft listening to the sounds of the cabin below. Crow was always already up. She could hear him before she could see anything, the scrape of the fire being stoked, the particular sound of the water bucket being lifted and set, the occasional soft creak of boots on floorboards. He moved quietly for a large man, not carefully, not like someone trying not to be heard, but with the natural economy of a person who had lived alone long enough that unnecessary noise had simply stopped occurring to him. She would lie there for a few minutes listening and trying to get her bearings, which took longer than usual because her bearings were, objectively, very strange. She was in a loft in a mountain cabin. She had no farm to go back to. She had no uncle, really, anymore. Or she had one, but he had ceased to be useful as a category. She had a canvas bag with her mother's comb in it, and a pocket full of seeds, and a legal arrangement with a man she'd known for less than a week. Then she'd get up, because lying in the dark thinking about it didn't change any of it. She came down the ladder the third morning and found Crow standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the clearing. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that particular deep blue before the sun came. He heard her on the ladder and glanced over, then back at the window. "Coffee's on," he said. "Thank you." She found the tin cup on the shelf, poured from the pot, and stood at the other end of the window. They stood there for a few minutes without talking, watching the light change. A deer came out of the tree line at the far edge of the clearing. A doe, picking her way careful and slow through the frost-stiff grass. They both watched it. "She's been coming since October," Crow said. "The same one?" "Same one. She's got a notch in her left ear." Evelyn looked. The doe had moved closer now, close enough to see. There it was, a small V-shaped tear in the left ear, old and healed. "How'd she get it?" "Don't know. Before my time, maybe." The doe raised her head, looked directly at the window for a moment with the flat dark eyes of an animal that has made its peace with uncertainty, and then went back to grazing. Evelyn drank her coffee and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not comfort exactly, not safety, not happiness. Something smaller and more tentative than all of those. Something like the first thin warmth of a fire that isn't certain yet whether it's going to catch. She did not tell him this. She finished her coffee and went to start breakfast. The arrangement between them took shape the way arrangements do when two people are practical rather than sentimental about necessity, through small adjustments, most of them unspoken. Evelyn cooked. Not because he'd asked her to, not because it was any condition of the arrangement, but because she liked cooking, and because after 3 days of watching him eat the kind of food a man makes when cooking is merely a matter of survival, dense, flavorless things produced with the minimum of effort, she had decided something needed to be done about it. The first morning, she made proper biscuits from the flour on the shelf, and when he bit into one and went still for a moment, she knew she'd been right. "These are good," he said. Your sourdough starter is still alive, barely. I fed it this morning. He looked at her. I forgot it was there. How long have you had it? He thought about it. 7, 8 years? She didn't ask where it had come from. Something in his face when he said it suggested the question led somewhere private, and she had no right to go there yet. In exchange, though he never framed it as exchange, he began doing things she didn't ask for. The third day, she came back from the outhouse in the early dark to find he'd added a second hook to the entry wall, at a height that suited her rather than him. She noticed it without saying anything. He didn't mention it. The fifth day, she went to the loft to find a second wool blanket folded at the end of the mattress. The nights had been dropping hard, down into the kind of cold that gets into everything, and she had been managing with the two she already had, but not well. She came down and looked at him. There was an extra in the barn, he said, without looking up from the harness he was mending. It was just sitting there. Right, she said, getting moth-eaten. I'm sure, she said. The corner of his mouth did that thing again, almost a smile, not quite. She went back up to the loft before he could see her doing the same. She explored the place in increments because she was not the kind of person to rush into spaces that weren't hers. Each day she went a little farther. The barn first, where she found 4 horses in varying states of impressiveness, a good-sized feed supply, and a collection of tools that suggested a man who took care of things. Then the kitchen garden, which she walked in the thin November sunlight with her hands in her pockets, reading the bones of it, where the beds were, how they drained, what had been planted, and where. She could see it had once been seriously tended. It was not a neglected garden, but a suspended one, like someone had meant to get back to it and hadn't yet found the moment. The third exploration was the woodshed, which was attached to the north wall of the cabin, and which she entered to find not only the woodpile she'd seen from the outside, but, on the back wall, a set of small shelves holding jars of preserved food. She stood in the cold of the shed and counted them. Beans, 3 kinds. 2 types of berry jam, labels in handwriting she didn't recognize. Looping, feminine, careful. Green tomato relish. Pickled beets. Apple butter. She stood looking at those jars for a long time. She didn't touch them. She went back inside without saying anything. That evening, at supper, venison stew she'd made from the roast he'd brought back that afternoon, she said without ceremony, "There are jars in the woodshed. Preserves." He didn't look up from his bowl. "I know," he said. "They're not from this year." "No." She waited, but he didn't add anything. She ate her stew. He ate his. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind worked through the pines. "I won't touch them," she said finally, "if you'd rather I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You can use whatever's there," he said. "It should be used." And then, after a pause that felt careful, "She'd have wanted it used." Evelyn nodded. She didn't ask who. That question she stored away for another time, or maybe for never, if never was what he needed. But, By the end of the second week, she had found her shape within the cabin and the days around it. Mornings she cooked and managed the interior, not in any spirit of obedient domesticity, but in the spirit of someone who has always kept things running and can't easily stop. She cleaned and organized and made small improvements, put paper under the flour crock to catch the spills that had been grinding into the shelf for years, found the broken latch on the window, and fixed it with a piece of wire she located in the toolbox, identified the draft that came through the east wall at knee height, and sealed it with a strip of cloth cut from a worn shirt she found in the rag pile. Crow watched these interventions with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not objection, not quite approval either, because he wasn't the kind of man who announced approval. More like the attention of someone who has been living with a small, persistent problem for so long that he'd stopped noticing it. And now someone else was solving it, and the solving required him to notice it again. "The latch has been broken for 2 years," he said, watching her tighten the wire. "Did you know how to fix it?" "Yes." "But you didn't." "I didn't," he agreed without apparent embarrassment. She finished the wire and tested the latch twice. It held. "Why not?" He shrugged. "Didn't bother me enough." "The draft didn't bother you either, I suppose." "I run warm." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her work. and he had the air of a man who has just been gently but accurately accused of something and is willing to stand by it. She turned back to the wall. "You live like someone who doesn't expect to still be here," she said. She said it without thinking, and for a moment after the words were out, she wasn't sure she should have. It was too direct, too close to something. She heard him not respond and thought she'd pushed it, and then, "Maybe," he said. Just that. One word. But it sat in the room with a weight that told her she'd landed near something true, and she left it alone. Afternoons, when the weather allowed, she went outside. She walked the property, the full extent of it, which was more than she'd first understood from the clearing. The meadow behind the cabin, winterized, but telling her things about what it would be in spring. A stream, a quarter-mile east, that came down off the rock face and hadn't frozen yet because it moved too fast. A stand of aspens on the southern slope, every trunk white and bare. She found the trail he used to reach the upper country. She could see where the horse's hooves had broken through the frost crust, heading up into the timber. She found a second structure one afternoon about 300 yards west of the cabin, half hidden in the trees, a small, roofless building, stone walls intact, fireplace still standing. Not a barn, not quite a cabin. She stood in the open rectangle of it and looked at the sky through where the roof had been. It had burned at some point. She could see the char on the upper stones, the particular scorched shadow on the interior wall. But a long time ago. The char was weathered, the stones were clean. Whatever had burned here had burned years back. She heard him behind her. She didn't turn. What was this? "First cabin," he said. "Built it when I first came up here." A pause. "I built the current one after." After what? He came and stood beside her in the roofless walls. He looked at the fireplace, at the scorched stones, at the sky. "After a fire," he said. 12 years ago. She waited. She had learned to wait with him, that he sometimes kept talking after you expected him to stop, and that pushing him never produced anything worth having, while patience sometimes did. "My wife and son were inside," he said. The words fell into the cold air of the ruined cabin, and she felt them land. Not with shock exactly, because something in the back of her mind had been assembling this story for days. Those jars with the feminine handwriting, the way he moved through the cabin like a man being careful not to disturb something he'd stopped being able to see. But with the particular weight of confirmed grief, the weight of knowing that the hollow quality she'd sensed in him had a shape. "Gideon," she said, "I wasn't here." He said it with a flatness that wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the controlled surface of too much feeling, held down by years of repetition. "I was at the lower trap line. I saw the smoke from a mile away." She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything that the situation required by courtesy, but not by truth. She stood in the roofless cabin and looked at the charred fireplace and felt the grief of it, the stranger's grief. And she understood finally and fully why he lived at the top of a mountain and kept the world at bay and had not gone back to the jars in the woodshed. After a moment she said, "How old was your son?" 4, Gideon said. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. They stood there for a while without talking. The wind came through the stone walls, and the aspens at the edge of the trees rattled their bare branches, and a raven circled once above the open roof, slow and dark against the gray sky, then banked away over the ridge. Eventually Gideon turned and walked back toward the cabin. She followed, several steps behind, and neither of them spoke again until dinner. But something had shifted. She felt it, and she thought he did too, though neither of them acknowledged it directly, because that was not how they communicated. They communicated in adjustments and silences and the gradual relaxation of guardedness. And what had shifted was this. She understood now what she was working with. She understood the structure of his loss, and he knew she understood it, and that meant they had passed through something together. Not close, not intimate, nothing so fast or simple as that. But past the purely transactional understanding of two people sharing space into something that acknowledged shared human weight. That night he brought out a bottle of whiskey he kept on the high shelf. He poured 2 small measures without asking, pushed one across the table to her. She looked at the glass. "I don't usually drink." "You don't have to." She picked it up. "What are we drinking to?" He considered. "Surviving," he said. "Surviving," she repeated. They drank. The whiskey was rough, the kind that had been made with more ambition than craft. And she controlled the urge to cough, and when she set the glass down, she found him watching her with something that was close to amusement. "Go ahead," he said. "Go ahead what?" "Make the face." "I'm not making a face." "You want to?" She put the glass down carefully. "It tastes like a pine tree fell into a fire." He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. It was short and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while, but it was real. She stared at him. He looked almost startled by it himself, like he'd forgotten he could do that. And then he pressed his mouth together and looked at the table, and she looked at the table too. They didn't speak for a while, but it was a different kind of silence than the earlier ones. "Evelyn?" he said eventually. "I want to be clear about something." She looked up. "What's in that courthouse document? You don't owe me anything beyond what you're willing to give. I don't keep count. There's no ledger." He was looking at the table, not at her. "If you decide you want to leave, I'll help you get where you're going. I know people in Cheyenne who could use someone good at managing a household. I'll write you a letter." She watched him for a moment. "You're worried I feel trapped. I know you don't have a lot of options. I just want you to know the options you do have." She thought about the courthouse, about the rope on her wrists, about the people of Deadwood Creek deciding collectively that she wasn't worth even the gesture of a raised hand, about her uncle's face, that complicated, gutless expression. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "I'm not leaving." She said it steadily, not dramatically, like a fact, not a declaration. "Not because I have nowhere to go, because—" She stopped, trying to find the honest version of it. "I'm useful here. I haven't been somewhere I was actually useful in a long time." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, like this was a reason he understood and respected, and he didn't push it further, and she was grateful for that, because the honest version was also deeper than she'd said. It included the dough with the notched ear coming out of the tree line in the blue morning light, and the sourdough starter that had survived 8 years alone on a shelf, and the way this cabin had started to feel in 2 weeks, more genuinely like shelter than the farm she'd spent 14 years keeping alive ever had. But she kept that part to herself. It was too soon for that. December came, and with it the first serious snow. She woke to find the world outside the loft window white in a way that reorganized everything. The tree line blurred, the clearing filled in, the trail to the upper country smoothed over and unmarked. She lay and watched it falling past the glass, thick and steady and purposeful. When she came down the ladder, Crow already had the fire up and the coffee on and was standing at the main window looking out. "How bad will it get?" she asked. "This?" He shook his head. "This is nothing. November, December snow comes and goes. January is when it gets serious." "What does serious look like?" "Drifts over the door, horses locked in the barn for 2 weeks at a stretch, wood running low if you didn't plan right." He turned and looked at the woodpile visible through the window. "We're fine on wood." She noticed the "we" and didn't say anything. She spent the snowed-in morning going through the provisions more systematically than she had before, taking actual inventory, doing the arithmetic in her head. They were well stocked, better than she'd expected, given what she'd seen of his approach to maintenance and planning. Either he planned better for winter than for window latches, or someone had once taught him to plan for it and the habit had stuck. She thought she knew which. She organized the shelves by category, rewrapped things that needed rewrapping, put a cloth over the flower crock she'd been meaning to make for the crock since she arrived. He came in from the barn at mid-morning, stamping snow from his boots, and stopped when he saw the reorganized shelves. "You moved things," he said. "I organized them." She was kneeling in front of the lower shelf, relabeling a jar she'd relabeled wrong the first time. "Everything you need daily is at eye level now, preserves on the bottom, backstock behind." He looked at the shelves for a moment. "I knew where everything was." "You knew where you'd put it. There's a difference." A pause. "Is there?" "Where's the salt?" He pointed without hesitating. Then he looked at where he'd pointed, which was the third shelf on the left, his previous location. He looked at where the salt now was, top shelf, right side, accessible in the dark without having to think about it. He pressed his mouth together. "Fine," he said. "I thought so." She stood up and went to wash her hands. He sat down at the table and pulled his hat off and set it crown down the way men do when they're settling in for a while, and he picked up the piece of harness he'd been working on since November without ever appearing to make significant progress on it. "Tell me something," he said. She looked over. "What?" "About before, where you grew up." She was quiet for a moment, not resisting but locating the story, finding where it started, which was harder than it should have been because there were several places it could start depending on what you were trying to explain. "Nebraska," she said. "My parents had a homestead claim, eastern Nebraska, near a town called Gracie. They died when I was 9. Fever, both of them, inside of a week." "And you went to your uncle?" "He was the only family left. His wife, Clara, she was kind. She's the one who showed me how to keep a house, how to put up vegetables, how to cook things worth eating. She started on the evening biscuits because her hands liked to be occupied when she talked about things that mattered. She died when I was 14. After that, it was just me and Harlan. And the farm. And the farm." She measured the flour by feel, the way Clara had taught her. "I don't think he meant it badly. I think he wanted things to be easy, and they weren't. And he kept making decisions that would make them easier in the short run and harder in every run after that. Until he ran out of short runs." She looked at him. He was looking at the harness in his hands, not at her, but the quality of his attention had shifted, the way attention shifts when someone is listening rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. "Until he ran out," she agreed. The snow fell. The biscuits rose. The fire popped and settled, and the cabin smelled of pine sap and coffee and the beginnings of dinner. And outside the world was white and still, and the clearing was empty except for the doe, who had come back out of the tree line and was standing at the edge of the snow, her notched ear tracking some sound the two people inside couldn't hear. By January, she knew the lay of the upper country well enough to name the landmarks for herself. The wide shelf of granite she thought of as the flat rock, the thick stand of spruce on the north-facing slope she called the dark timber, the place where the creek bent around a boulder and made a little pool that was the last thing to freeze. She had never been up to Crow's trap lines, but she knew the general route he took from the direction he headed and the time he was usually gone. She'd started helping with the horses, not because he'd asked, because she'd walked into the barn one morning and found him trying to re-shoe the gray one-handed while holding a lantern in the other, which was not working as well as he seemed to want to admit, and she'd taken the lantern without comment and held it where it needed to be. After that, it became an understood thing. She helped in the barn when he was doing something that required an extra pair of hands, and he didn't make a production of thanking her for it, which she appreciated because she didn't want thanks. She wanted usefulness, and the absence of excessive gratitude was its own kind of respect. She was teaching herself to track. She wouldn't have called it that exactly. She'd have said she was learning to read the snow, which was what it felt like. Crow had mentioned once, in passing, that the rabbit population in the East Meadow was down this year, and she'd started paying attention to the prints when she walked out that way, counting trails, noting where they ran. She didn't say anything to him about this because she wasn't sure what she was doing yet, and she'd never liked presenting unfinished things. The evenings had become the part of the day she noticed most. After dinner, when the work was done and the fire was banked, they fell into a routine that neither of them had consciously designed. He read from a battered collection of books on the shelf. She'd been slowly identifying which ones he'd actually read versus which had come with the shelf, based on the state of their spines. She mended or worked on the small projects she'd accumulate through the day. Sometimes they talked, usually about practical things. What needed doing, what supplies were running low, the state of the weather. Sometimes they sat for an hour without saying anything, and the silence was the kind you can settle into rather than the kind you have to work around. One evening in late January, a wind had been working at the cabin for 3 days, and she'd been fighting a persistent headache that she hadn't mentioned because it wasn't worth mentioning. She'd given up on the mending and was just sitting by the fire with her hands in her lap, watching the flames, when she became aware that he'd put his book down and was looking at her. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm always quiet." Different kind of quiet. She glanced at him, slightly surprised that he had noticed a distinction. "Headache, it's nothing." He got up without comment and went to the shelf near the workbench and came back with a small tin she didn't recognize. He set it on the arm of her chair. "What is this?" "Peppermint oil. Rub a little on your temples. He sat back down. He stopped. Someone showed me once. It helps. She opened the tin. The smell of it was sharp and clean and cut through the stuffy indoor air in a way that helped immediately. She rubbed a small amount at her temples the way he'd indicated and sat back. After a while, she said, "Thank you." "It's in the tin," he said. "Keep it." She held the tin in her hands and watched the fire and thought about all the ways a person could be careful with another person's grief. All the small, imperfect, practical ways of honoring what couldn't be fixed. And she thought that Gideon Crow, for all his silences and his scarred hands and his two-word answers, understood more about this than most people she had known. She did not say any of this. She kept the tin. Outside, the wind worked at the eaves and the fire burned and the long mountain winter closed around the cabin. And inside it, two people who had each spent years believing they were better off alone were slowly, carefully, without ceremony or declaration, proving themselves wrong. February came in mean. Evelyn had lived through hard winters before. Nebraska winters that could drop 40 below and stay there for a week. Plains winters with nothing to break the wind for 100 miles in any direction. But she understood quickly that mountain winter was a different thing entirely. It wasn't just the cold, which was its own serious matter. It was the weight of it, the way the snow accumulated on the roof until she could hear the cabin timbers working under the pressure, the way the tree line disappeared behind curtains of white and the world contracted to the clearing and what was immediately in it, the way February light came in thin and sideways and was gone by 4 in the afternoon, leaving the long dark that pressed against the windows like something with intentions. Crow moved through it with the accustomed ease of a man who has stopped being surprised by what winter can do. He checked the roof load every 3 days. He kept a rope strung between the cabin door and the barn so he could find his way back in a whiteout. He monitored the woodpile with the ongoing attention of a man who understood exactly how the arithmetic between fuel and cold worked out if you got it wrong. He showed her these things without making a lesson of them, just did them in her presence, and she watched and understood. They had fallen into a winter routine that was, she sometimes thought, more genuinely companionable than anything she'd experienced in years. Not romantic, nothing so clean or uncomplicated as that, something harder to categorize. Two people who had each been profoundly alone for a long time, learning the specific grammar of being not alone. It involved a lot of small negotiations, most of them silent. Who banked the fire at night? Whose turn it was to bring snow in for melting? The precise distance of mutual privacy they each required in the mornings before enough coffee had been consumed to constitute human communication. She told him more about Nebraska. He told her in pieces, small pieces that came out unpredictably, things about the years before he'd come to the mountain. He'd ranched, she knew now, in Wyoming. He'd had a partner in the operation, a man named Rutherford, who he spoke about in the spare, fond shorthand of someone who had been a genuine friend. Rutherford had sold his share and gone to California, and they hadn't spoken in 6 years, which Crow said without visible regret, but which she had come to recognize as the flat tone he used when something cost him. He had not said more about his wife and son than he'd said in the burned cabin that November afternoon. She had not asked. They had each located the edges of what the other could carry, and they navigated around those edges with a care that was its own kind of intimacy. On the 8th of February, the sky turned the particular color of old iron that she had learned to pay attention to, not the flat gray of ordinary overcast, something yellower beneath it, something that put a particular pressure on the air, a stillness in the pines that felt like held breath. She said at breakfast, "The sky looks wrong." Crow had been eating without looking up. He glanced at the window, looked longer than he usually looked at things, set down his spoon. "It does," he said. "Is that the bad kind?" "That is the bad kind." He stood and went to the window and stood there for a moment with his arms crossed, reading whatever it was he read in skies that she hadn't yet learned to read. "There's a system coming in from the northwest. Big one, feels like." He turned. "I need to get up to the high trap line today, before it hits." "When will it hit?" "Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning, if we're lucky." He went to get his coat. "It's a 3-hour ride each way. I'll be back by dark." She looked at the window again, at the iron-yellow sky. "Is it safe to go up now?" "Safer than losing 3 weeks of trap lines," he said. "I'll be back before dark." She nodded, because he knew this mountain better than she knew anything, and because arguing with a man who has spent 11 years reading the same sky seemed presumptuous. He left at 8 in the morning. She watched him go from the porch, the gray horse picking through the snow on the upper trail, Crow's figure diminishing into the dark timber. And then she went inside and started on the list of things she could usefully do in a snowbound day. By noon, the wind had started. Not dramatically at first, just a change in the sound of the pines. The ordinary conversation of branches becoming something more agitated, more directional. She went out to bring in the last of the chopped wood from the far pile, moving quickly, and while she was stacking it inside, she noticed the temperature had dropped in the hour since she'd last been out. Noticeably dropped. The kind of drop you feel in your chest before you feel it on your skin. She made soup, she fed the horses, she checked the water barrel. She did the things that needed doing, and she watched the window and she tracked the light, which was going the wrong direction, getting darker by mid-afternoon rather than maintaining the thin winter plateau that constituted daylight up here. By 2 o'clock, the snow had started. By 3, it was serious. By 3:30, standing at the window watching the tree line go gray, and then white, and then invisible, she understood that this was not the ordinary mountain snow she had spent 3 months learning to manage. This was something older and larger, and significantly less interested in whether the people caught in it survived. The wind was coming from the northwest the way Crow had said, and it was hitting the clearing and the cabin with a sustained force that rattled the windows in their frames and drove the snow horizontally past the glass in thick white sheets. She told herself he knew the mountain. She told herself he had done this 11 years, and he was not a careless man, and he would have already been heading down when the system came in harder than expected, would already be on the trail, would walk through the door in the next hour, stamping snow from his boots, and telling her in his flat two-word way that it had gotten worse faster than he'd thought, and they'd be inside for 3 days. She told herself this at 3:30, at 4. At 4:30, when the light had fully given up and the world outside was nothing but wind and white, and the dark was coming down like something final. She put 2 extra logs on the fire and sat by it and listened to the storm and told herself everything she could think of to tell herself. He did not come. At 5, she put on every layer of clothing she owned. She was not making a decision, exactly. She was getting dressed in case she needed to have made one. There was a difference, or she told herself there was, while she pulled on the wool socks and the second pair of trousers over the first in her own coat, and then, after a moment's consideration, Crow's coat from the hook by the door on top of her own, because it was larger and heavier, and if she was going to be outside in this, she needed everything it had to offer. She found his spare lantern on the shelf beside the workbench, filled it, found the matches in the tin where they lived. She stood in the middle of the cabin in all those layers, lantern in hand, and thought about this rationally. She did not know the upper trail. She had never been on it. In good weather, that was a manageable deficit. She could follow the horse tracks, follow the trail markers she'd noticed Crow had cut into the trees at intervals. In this, with 3 hours of fresh snow and the wind erasing everything, the tracks were gone. The markers might be visible or might not, depending on how the snow had built up on the trunk faces. She also thought about this. Gideon Crow was 40-some years old and had spent 11 winters on this mountain. If he was not back yet in this storm, it was not because he had miscalculated the weather and was simply running behind. A man who read skies the way he did not make that kind of mistake. Something had gone wrong. She blew out the thought before it could become an image and opened the door. The storm hit her like a physical object. The cold and the wind came together in a force that pushed her back a step on the porch, and for a moment she just stood there being hit by it, breathing through her teeth, getting her bearings. The lantern flame guttered and recovered inside its glass. She could see the porch rail. She could see the first 3 feet of the yard. Beyond that, white and wind and nothing. She went down the porch steps. What? The rope. He'd strung it between the door and the barn. She grabbed it before she'd consciously thought about it, found it by feel when her hand hit the porch post, and she ran her fingers along until she found where it tied. She followed it to the barn because the barn was the beginning of the upper trail, and inside the barn she stood in the relative quiet of animal warmth and blowing straw and thought about what she was doing. The 3 remaining horses turned their heads and looked at her with the patient, interested expression of horses confronted with a human who is clearly doing something inadvisable. "I know," she told them. She took the second best horse, not the gray, which was Crow's preferred animal and not hers to make decisions about, but the bay mare who had been tolerating her increasingly competent handling with what seemed like cautious approval. She saddled her with hands that were steadier than she felt, which was a thing her body had always done for her in moments of real urgency. The shaking came after, never during. She strapped the lantern to the saddle horn with a length of leather, checked it twice, and led the mare to the barn door. She opened it, and the storm came in. The mare held steady. Evelyn had half expected her to refuse, and the fact that she didn't felt like something, not permission exactly, but a kind of companionship in the decision. She mounted, pointed the mare at where the upper trail should be, where the trees should be, where the first trail marker should sit about 40 feet in from the barn. "Okay," she said, to herself or to the horse, or to neither. She rode into the storm. The first quarter mile was the worst. Not because the terrain was hardest there, but because she was still calibrating, learning how the storm moved, where the wind came from, and how it changed as the trees thickened, how to read what her eyes couldn't tell her from what the horse was telling her through her legs and hands. The mare knew the lower trail well enough that she moved with purpose even through the drifted snow, and Evelyn learned to trust that purpose rather than override it with her own limited knowledge. She found the first trail marker by almost riding past it, a blaze cut high on a pine trunk, visible as a pale vertical stripe against the bark. She exhaled when she found it, found the second one 150 yards further on. The temperature kept dropping. She could feel it with clinical specificity, first in her face, which was the only skin exposed, then working through the layers of coat and wool in the way deep cold does, not through the fabric but around it, finding the edges. She kept her face turned slightly away from the wind and breathed through the wool of Crow's coat collar and kept moving. The trail steepened after the first mile. The mare slowed, picking her feet up higher through drifts that were knee-deep in the open stretches, shallower where the timber was thick enough to break the wind. Evelyn learned the rhythm of it, slow in the open, move when the trees gave cover. She called out twice. The first time she felt foolish about it, her voice swallowed immediately by the wind as though it had never existed. The second time she didn't feel foolish at all, just desperate, and the desperate calling felt more honest. The wind took both. She found him at the 2-mile mark, or approximately 2 miles. She was estimating by time and pace, because landmarks were useless in this. She almost didn't see him. The gray horse was what she saw first, standing several yards off the trail in the timber, just standing there in the snow with his reins trailing, which was wrong, which was the wrongest possible thing a horse without a rider could be doing, and she turned the mare toward it before she'd fully processed what she was seeing. Then she saw Crow. He was on the ground on the uphill side of a pine that was roughly the diameter of her torso. It had come down at some point in the afternoon. She could see the raw break at the trunk base, the wood pale and new broken against the dark bark, which meant it had been recent. It had come down across the trail at the base of a steep section where the snow had undercut the root system, and when it fell, it had taken Crow with it. Or he had been under it when it fell. She couldn't tell the sequence, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that the lower trunk was across his right leg, and he was conscious. She could see him moving, could see him turn his head toward the lantern light, but he was not getting up. She was off the horse before the mare had fully stopped. Gideon. She was beside him in 3 steps, crouching in the snow next to him, her hands finding his face, his shoulders, looking for blood, looking for the most urgent thing. His face was gray. Not gray the way faces get in cold, which is a particular bloodless pallor, but gray the way faces get when a person has been managing extreme pain alone for some time and has used up the obvious resources. Evelyn, his voice was rough, not the rough of cold, the rough of someone who had been gritting their teeth hard for hours. "I've got you. I'm here." She looked at the tree. The main trunk had caught him above the knee on the right leg, pinned him to the ground. She could see the angle of the leg beneath it, and she could see, without any medical training, that the angle was wrong. "The leg's broken," he said, like she might not have noticed. "I can see that." She was already assessing the tree, the diameter of the section pinning him, the length of it, whether there was any purchase for her to work with. "How long?" "Since about 2. His jaw was tight. "I couldn't move it. I tried. It was past 5. He'd been here in the snow for 3 hours. Her throat did something she couldn't allow it to do, and she closed it down and looked at the tree. The section pinning him was roughly 12 feet long, with the break at one end and the branching point at the other where it joined the main trunk. It was not as massive as it looked. She was trying to be honest with herself about this, because if she told herself it was impossible, she wouldn't be able to do what she needed to do. The snow had built up on top of it, which added weight. But the tree itself was maybe 8–10 inches in diameter at the narrowest point. It was a great deal of weight, and it was distributed in the worst possible way across an injured person in a blizzard, but it was not absolutely impossible. She stood up. "What are you doing?" he said. "Getting you out from under that." "Evelyn, don't." She moved to the uphill end of the section where it angled against the ground. "Stop talking. You can't lift, Gideon." She turned and looked at him, and whatever was on her face in that moment made him stop. She turned back to the tree. She'd moved timber before. Not often, not habitually, but she'd been on a farm her whole life, and timber came down, and sometimes there was no one to help, and you moved it, or you didn't. She understood the physics of it. Not the formal physics, not the equations, but the working knowledge. Find the lever point. Take the weight at the right angle. Use the length of the section against its own mass. She found a branch stub on the section that would give her grip. Planted her feet in the snow with her boots, finding something solid underneath. Got her hands around the branch stub and the trunk together. The first try did nothing. She expected this. She repositioned, bent lower, changed the angle of her pull from straight up to up and forward, putting her legs under it rather than her back. The second try moved it. Not much. Barely an inch. But it moved, and that inch produced a sound from Crow that was not quite a word, and she registered that sound and used it. The third try, she moved it 6 inches. She could feel the tree wanting to settle back the moment she relaxed pressure, the snow shifting underneath, shifting everything, and she had to hold it while she figured out the next problem, which was that she needed to hold this and somehow get him out from under it, and she only had 2 hands. "Can you move?" she said. Her voice was coming out strained. She was shaking with the effort of holding the weight. "My arms work." He was already trying. She could hear him moving, could hear the effort in his breathing. "Then move, now, toward me." She held it. She held it while he dragged himself, with his arms and one leg, across the snow toward her. The sounds he made doing this were the sounds of a man who was well past his limit and doing the thing anyway. And she held it until she heard him say, "I'm clear." And then she let it go, and it dropped back with a sound she felt in her feet, and she stood there for 2 seconds just breathing. Then she turned around. He was sitting in the snow, right leg at the wrong angle, face white, both hands pressed flat to the ground, because that was what was keeping him upright. Snow had built up on his shoulders and hat brim in the time they'd been there. She crouched in front of him. She put her hands on either side of his face and made him look at her. His eyes were dark and steady and full of pain and something else, something that might have been, in a man who had fewer reasons to be surprised by things, astonishment. "We have to get you onto the horse," she said. "That's 2 miles, he said. "I know how far it is." "Evelyn, my leg—" "I know about your leg." She stood up and went to get the gray horse, which had waited patiently in the trees this entire time, like the professional animal it was. She led it back, positioned it as close to Crow as she could manage in the snow. "You're going to have to work with me. I can't do this part alone." "You shouldn't have come up here," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Now get on the horse." Getting him onto the gray was the most physically difficult thing she had done in a life that had contained a great deal of physically difficult things. He could use his arms and his left leg, and she could take his weight on her shoulders and get him high enough that he could hook his arms over the saddle and then heave. But the right leg had to be moved, and the right leg was broken, and there was no version of moving it that didn't involve him making sounds she was going to hear in her sleep for a long time. He didn't make a sound. She didn't know how he managed it. She watched his face and saw what it cost him. Watched him take the pain somewhere internal and hold it there, jaw locked, eyes forward, and she thought she had never seen anything require more of a person than what it required of Gideon Crow to get himself onto that horse. When he was up and situated, she tied the reins to the gray's saddle horn to keep them from being dropped, mounted the mare, took the gray's lead. "Hold on," she told him. I'm holding, he said. They went back down the mountain. Ma. The return trip was longer than the ride up, which she'd known it would be, but the knowing hadn't fully prepared her. Crow was upright on the gray, holding with his arms and his good leg, but he was burning through reserves he didn't have, and she could see it in the incremental changes in his posture. The slight forward list that got more pronounced as the miles passed, the way his grip on the saddle horn changed from tight to merely maintained. She talked to him, not about anything consequential. She wasn't capable of anything consequential at that point. She was cold through every layer, and her arms ached from the tree, and the wind was still driving snow sideways in the dark, and she needed her concentration for the trail. She talked about the barn, about the stew she'd left warming by the fire, about the fact that she'd finally identified what was wrong with the barn door hinge and how she intended to fix it in spring. She talked the way you talk to someone to keep them present, to give them a sound to track in the dark, and she kept the mare close enough to the gray that she could see his silhouette in the lantern light and know he was still upright. He talked back, occasionally. Short answers, but answers. Once, on a steep section where she needed to pay attention to the trail, there was a long silence and she said, "Gideon," sharply, and he said, "I'm here," without any particular urgency, like a man reporting in, and she breathed again. The barn door came out of the dark like a promise she hadn't let herself make. She got down first, tied the mare, and went to him. He'd made it 2 miles on a broken leg through a blizzard on horseback, and the last of whatever had been keeping him organized had used itself up, and she had to take most of his weight getting him down from the gray. He tried to help. He was not entirely successful. She got him down and got his arm across her shoulders, and they moved, step by careful step, through the barn and across the covered walkway and through the cabin door. The heat from the fire hit them like a wall. She got him to the bed in the corner, his bed, the one he'd given up for her in November, and got him onto it and went immediately for the fire, adding wood, because he was cold the way a person gets cold when they've been out too long and the temperature needs to come back from the outside in. She pulled both blankets from the loft. She got his coat off, no easy thing with the broken leg making every movement a full-body negotiation, and got the wet outer layers replaced with dry ones from the shelf. She splinted the leg with 2 of the fence boards she'd seen stacked by the woodpile, stripped from the smallest ones, padded with a torn wool blanket and bound with strips she cut from a spare shirt. She'd never set a splint before. She'd read about it once in the medical volume she'd found on Crow's shelf, and read out of curiosity in December, and she was grateful now for the curiosity with an intensity that surprised her. He watched her work with the focused stillness of a man managing serious pain. "You've done that before," he said. "No." "You look like you've done it before." "I read about it." She tied the last strip, checked her work. "It's not a real set. You need a doctor for that. This is just to keep it from getting worse until we can get you down to Deadwood Creek. That won't be for a few days." "I know." "Storm's still going." "I know, Gideon." He was quiet for a moment. She was still crouched over the leg, running her fingers along the splint boards to check the tension. His hand came to rest, briefly, on the top of her head. Not a caress, not deliberate, just a hand resting somewhere, the way you reach out when you're near the end of your resources, and there's something solid nearby. She went still. After a moment she looked up and he was looking at the ceiling, jaw tight, and she could see the exhaustion in every line of his face. Not just physical exhaustion, but the exhaustion of a man who has been holding himself together alone for 11 years, and tonight, for the first time in 11 years, hadn't had to. She stood up, went to get the soup from beside the fire. "You should have gone to Cheyenne, White," he said, while she ladled it. She brought the bowl to him. "Probably. It would have been safer. It would have been a lot of things." She put the bowl in his hands and made sure he had it before she let go. "Eat." He ate. She sat in the chair beside the bed and ate her own, and outside the storm worked at the cabin with everything it had, and the fire held, and the splinted leg was elevated on a folded blanket, and 2 people who had each survived the unsurvivable were quiet together in the warmth, while the mountain did its worst outside the walls. After a while he said quietly, almost not saying it, "Thank you." She looked at him. His eyes were closed. He was already most of the way to the sleep his body had been demanding for hours. "You would have done the same," she said. I would have tried, he said. I don't know if I would have made it. She thought about this, about what it meant, coming from this man who did not speak carelessly or offer assessments he didn't believe. Sleep, she said. He slept. She sat beside him in the firelight and listened to the storm and watched his face finally, completely, go slack, all the held together, walled-off tightness of it releasing into the plain, exhausted face of a person who is, for the moment, simply and mercifully asleep. And she felt something move through her chest that she had no name for yet, something warm and frightening and very much like the feeling of a fire that has crossed the point of uncertainty and is now simply burning. She put another log on the fire and stayed where she was. The storm blew itself out by the third morning. Evelyn knew it was over before she looked out the window. She knew it by the quality of the silence, which changed when the wind stopped from the pressurized, working silence of a storm to something older and emptier and more absolute. Mountain silence after a blizzard was a specific thing. It had texture to it. She lay in the chair she'd been sleeping in. She had not gone back to the loft, and neither of them had acknowledged this, and listened to the new quiet, and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been on alert for 72 hours and is only now allowed to stop. The fire had burned low. She got up stiffly, her back registering its opinion of 3 nights in a chair, and built it back up before she looked at him. He was awake. He'd been awake for a while, she thought. He had the look of a man who had been lying still, watching the ceiling and letting her sleep, which was a consideration she hadn't asked for and which landed somewhere it didn't have room to land yet. "Storm's done," she said. "Yes. How's the leg?" "Hurts. That's probably good. Means the circulation's still working." She'd read that too, in the medical volume. She wasn't certain she'd remembered it right, but it seemed like the correct thing. "I need to get you down to Deadwood Creek when you can travel. You need a real doctor." "I know." He shifted, and she saw the effort it cost him, and she did not offer to help because she had already learned that offering made it worse. She stood ready in case he needed her and let him manage what he could manage. "A few more days, the trail will need to settle." She nodded. A few more days was what she'd estimated, too. She made breakfast. The ordinary mechanics of it, the fire, the coffee, the biscuits that had become as much a part of the morning as the light itself, settled her in the way that routine settles people who've been through something unordinary. She moved around the cabin and felt the specific relief of a crisis that has been survived, which is its own strange country. Not happiness, not resolution, just the absence of immediate emergency, which after the storm felt like something profound. She brought his plate to the bed. He sat up against the wall. She'd folded blankets behind him the first morning to prop him, and took it without ceremony. "You slept in that chair 3 nights, he said. "I've slept in worse. You could go back to the loft." "I could." She sat in the chair with her own plate. "I'd rather stay down here until you can manage the ladder yourself." He didn't argue with this, which meant he understood it was practical rather than generous. Though it was both, and she thought he probably knew that too. They ate. Outside, through the window, the cleared sky had come in hard and blue, the way skies do after a serious storm. The kind of blue that looks like it's been scrubbed clean, too bright, and too sharp and beautiful, in a way that felt almost aggressive after 3 days of white nothing. The days of recovery had their own rhythm, slower and more interior than anything that had come before. Crow was not a good patient. She had not expected him to be. He was impatient with stillness in the specific way of active men, not complaining, not dramatic, just visibly and continuously at odds with a body that was declining to cooperate. He tried to do things he should not have tried to do. The first afternoon, he attempted to get to the workbench to finish the rifle mechanism he'd been reassembling since November, and she found him halfway across the room on one leg and the bench edge and 2 chairs and said, "Absolutely not," in a tone she hadn't known she had, and he looked at her for a moment and then reversed course without a word. She brought the work to him, set it up on a board across his lap so he could use his hands. He looked at her when she did this with an expression she was becoming familiar with, the expression of a man who is being well taken care of and is not sure what to do with that. "Better?" she said. "Better," he admitted. "Don't move the leg." "I won't move the leg." "You were going to move the leg." "I wasn't going to." He stopped. "I might have moved the leg." She went back to the fire. She heard him start on the rifle mechanism. The small, precise sounds of it, metal against metal, careful and methodical, settled into the background of the cabin the way the fire settled, and she worked on her own things, and the afternoon went. The talking came gradually. There was something about the confinement that loosened it. The narrowed world of the cabin, the closed-in days, the lack of the physical activity that usually gave them both somewhere else to put their energy. They had always talked, in the evenings, in the incremental way she'd described to herself as pieces. But these were different pieces, larger ones that came out because there was nothing else to fill the time with, and because something had shifted between them in the storm that couldn't be entirely unshifted. She was mending his spare shirt on the second afternoon when he said, out of no particular context, "Your uncle, did he ever hit you?" She didn't look up. "No?" But she kept working. The needle went in and came out. "He had a way of talking to me," she said after a moment. "Not all the time, just when things were bad, when he'd lost money or the crops were poor or he'd come back from wherever he'd been." She paused. "He would not shout. He wasn't a shouter. He'd just say things very quietly, like he was stating facts, that I was a burden, that without him I'd have been left on the road after my parents died and no one else would have taken me, that I should keep in mind what I actually was, in terms of—" She stopped, found the sentence. "In terms of what I was worth to anyone." The rifle mechanism sounds had stopped. "He believed it," she said. "I don't think he said it to be cruel. I think he genuinely believed it, and he thought he was being honest with me. And the thing about someone telling you something quietly and with conviction over a long time," she bit the thread, "you start to believe they know something you don't. Do you still believe it?" She thought about it honestly. "Some days," she said, "less than I used to. Being here—" She stopped herself. "Go on," he said. "Being here helped," she said simply. "Being somewhere I was useful. Being treated like a person who makes decisions rather than a problem that needs managing." She folded the shirt. "It helped." He was quiet for a long moment. "She said something like that once," he said. "Margaret." The name came out like he was checking whether he could still say it. "She said that what she needed from me wasn't protecting. She said she needed me to look at her like she was capable." Evelyn looked up. He was staring at the rifle parts on the board in his lap, not seeing them. "Did you?" "I tried." His jaw moved. "I was better at protecting than looking. It's easier to stand in front of something than to trust it to handle itself." A pause. "I was in the south pasture that afternoon. We'd had trouble with a fence line, cattle getting through into Ridley's land, and I'd gone to fix it. I told her I'd be back by noon." He stopped. "It was a windy day. The stovepipe had been loose since fall. I kept meaning to fix it." Evelyn sat very still. "By the time I saw the smoke—" He didn't finish that sentence. He set the board aside carefully, like he needed to do something with his hands, and nothing was available. "The roof had gone. I got the door open, but the inside was— There was nothing I could do. There was nothing left to do anything for." She wanted to say something and had nothing that was adequate, and so she said nothing, which she thought was probably right. "The fire in the stovepipe spread to the roof," he said. "That's what the county man said when he came. Faulty pipe fitting. 20-minute job to fix," he said. 20-minute job." He turned the rifle barrel over in his hands. "I came up here because I couldn't be around people who knew me, who knew what I had and what I'd failed to keep." He set the barrel down. "And because I didn't see a reason to be anywhere in particular." "Do you still feel that way?" He looked at her. Full on, directly, the way he rarely looked at her. Usually, his attention was adjacent, close, but not aimed. This was aimed. "No," he said. "Not for a while now." She held that without responding to it because responding to it required acknowledging what it meant, and she was not ready to do that in the flat afternoon light with the splinted leg between them and the storm just 3 days past. She tucked it somewhere she could look at later. "The stovepipe on this cabin," she said. "When did you last check the fitting?" A beat of silence, then, "Fall." "I'll look at it when the weather breaks." "Evelyn?" "I'll look at it," she said. Not unkindly, just firmly. "It needs to be looked at, that's all." He pressed his mouth together, nodded. She picked up the mending again. He picked up the rifle mechanism. They worked in silence, and the fire burned, and the blue light outside the window turned the slow amber of late afternoon. And neither of them said anything more about Margaret or Harlan or the 20-minute job or the thing he'd said about not feeling that way for a while now, but all of it sat in the room with them, present and acknowledged, the way true things tend to sit when they've finally been allowed out. By the 5th day, he was moving on a rough crutch she'd made from a forked branch, using it with the concentrated deliberateness of a man who has decided that limitation is a condition to be solved rather than accepted. She watched him practice on it one morning without comment, watched him miscalculate the swing and catch the leg wrong and stand absolutely still for 10 seconds managing the result, and then start again. "You're doing it wrong," she said. He looked at her. "Weight on your hand, not your armpit. You'll bruise the armpit and lose feeling in your arm." She crossed the room and adjusted the crutch height by notching the branch lower with his knife. "Try again." He tried again. The difference was immediate. He moved down the length of the cabin and back with something approaching efficiency. "Better," she said. "Where did you learn that?" "Old man Pritchett, on the farm 2 miles east of Harlan's. He used a crutch for 20 years after a plowing accident. Swore by the hand position." "You paid attention to everything," he said, not a criticism. Something closer to wonder. "I didn't have a lot else to do," she said, "and people will teach you things if you let them. If you act like what they know is worth knowing." He stood on the crutch and looked at her. "Most people don't act that way. Most people are too busy thinking about what they know." He almost smiled. The almost smile had been happening more in the past 5 days than it had in the previous 3 months, and she had noticed this and was not sure what to do with the noticing. On the 6th evening, the wolves came. She heard them first, the sound carrying over the frozen clearing in the way sound carries in deep, cold, clear, and very close. And she went to the window and saw them at the edge of the tree line. 3 of them, big gray animals, moving along the timber edge in the indirect way of animals that are interested in the barn and are trying not to show it. "Wolves," she said. Crow was already reaching for the rifle, which he'd finished reassembling 2 days ago. "How many?" "3. At the tree line, west side." He got the rifle and got up, faster than she expected on the crutch, with the particular efficiency of a man for whom this was not the first time, and came to the window beside her. She could smell the cold coming off the glass, and the particular smell of him, wood smoke and pine, and something underneath that she had simply come to know as his. "I need to go out," he said. "You can't go out on that leg in the dark." "If they get to the horses, I'll go." She was already getting her coat. "Evelyn, you're not going out there with wolves in the yard." "I've dealt with wolves before." This was not entirely true. She had dealt with one wolf, alone, at a distance, with a shotgun and daylight on her side. This was 3 wolves at night, and she had a rifle she had fired exactly twice. "Where are the shells?" "Evelyn, Gideon." She turned and looked at him in the lamplight. He was standing on the crutch with the rifle in his hand and the expression of a man doing the math on whether he could get across the yard faster than he thought, and she could see him calculating it, and she could see it coming out wrong. "You cannot run on that leg. If something goes wrong out there and you need to move fast, you can't. I can." She held his gaze. "Where are the shells?" He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something complicated in it. Something that was not just the immediate practical problem of wolves and horses, but something older. He told her where the shells were. She loaded the rifle. She had watched him do it, and she had the sequence right. He could see her checking the process, and her hands were not shaking. And she checked the lamp and said, "Keep the door open," and went out onto the porch. The cold hit her clean and absolute, the temperature dropping hard after dark the way it had since the storm. The yard was bright with moonlight on fresh snow, the tree line dark beyond it, and she could see 2 of the 3 wolves clearly, big animals, watching her, their breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. She fired into the air. The sound of it cracked across the clearing and echoed off the rock face, and the wolves broke for the timber immediately, running hard, and she stood on the porch with the rifle and watched until she was certain they were gone and not circling. She stood there a moment longer. Her heart was going. She noticed this with a kind of clinical interest, the adrenaline arriving after the fact, the way it always did. She went back inside. Crow was at the door. He'd been standing at it. She could see he'd been ready to come through it. And when she came in, he looked her over the way he'd looked her over in the courthouse the first day, checking for damage. "They ran," she said. "I heard." He stepped back to let her in. "You loaded the rifle right." "I know I did." She set it by the door and began unbuttoning her coat. He was still looking at her. In the lamplight, his face had the particular quality of a man who has just watched something that has changed the terms of a conversation he'd been having with himself for months and who has not yet figured out what he intends to do about it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Gideon." He turned away toward the fire, and she watched his back and waited. And the fire burned, and the night was deep and cold outside the windows. And she waited. "You walked into a blizzard," he said, to the fire. "Yes." 2 miles up in a whiteout, alone. "Yes." "And just now you—" He stopped. "You didn't hesitate." "Was I supposed to?" He turned. She stayed where she was, coat half on, watching him, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled flatness of a man managing his interior life, not the almost smile of his better moments. Something unguarded, something he'd stopped keeping under the surface. "I don't know what to do with you," he said. It came out rough, not unkind, raw in the way that honest things are raw when they've been held in too long. She was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "What does that mean?" "It means," he exhaled. "It means I've been telling myself since November that this was a practical arrangement, that you were here and I was helping in some sense, rectifying something." He was looking at her steadily now, that aimed look she didn't get often. "And every week you, fix something I didn't know was broken, or you go into a blizzard, or you stand on a courthouse platform with your chin up and don't give them the satisfaction, and I—" He stopped. She felt the room very precisely in that moment. The fire behind him, the lamp between them, the cold outside the windows, the rifle by the door. The distance across the floor that was maybe 8 feet and felt like something that was deciding whether to be more or less. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "I made a decision, after the fire, about what kind of life was available to me. And I've been living by that decision for 11 years. A pause. "And you're making it difficult to keep living by it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the courthouse, about the rope on her wrists, about being valued at nothing in front of people who'd known her for 14 years. She thought about Harlan's quiet voice telling her what she was worth, and how she'd carried that voice inside her like a creditor for years, reminding her of the debt. She thought about November mornings with coffee and the dough at the tree line, and the peppermint oil on the high shelf, and an extra blanket that was just sitting in the barn getting moth-eaten. She thought about 2 miles up a mountain in a blizzard and a pine tree across an impossible angle, and the sound he'd made getting onto that horse. "Gideon," she said, "I know what it is to decide you're only worth so much, to take what people told you about yourself and use it to set a limit on what you're allowed to want." She came forward, 2 steps, 3, until she was close enough to see his face clearly in the lamplight, and he could see hers. "I've been doing that my whole life, and I'm tired of it." He looked at her. "I love you," she said. It came out steadier than she'd expected, which surprised her. "I didn't plan to. I don't think either of us planned for any of this, but I've loved you since sometime around December, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't just because it doesn't fit the original arrangement." Something moved across his face, the last thing moving, the last guard coming down. And he reached out and took her face in his scarred hands the way she'd taken his face in the snow. And he was not graceful about it, and she didn't care. And he said, "I love you. I think I have since you reorganized my shelves and told me there was a difference between where I'd put things and where they should be." She laughed. It came out surprised, which was honest. "That is the least romantic thing," she said. "I know. I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine." He wasn't. He was rough and unpracticed, and the crutch was making the whole thing logistically complicated, and she was still half in her coat. And he pressed his forehead to hers, because that was what was available. And she put her hands over his, and they stood like that in the lamplight, while the fire burned and the mountain held the cold at bay outside, and none of it was smooth or scripted or the way these moments were supposed to go. It was exactly right. 2 days later, the trail had settled enough to travel. She had written to the doctor in Deadwood Creek when the storm broke. sent the letter down with a trapper who came through on his way to the valley, a man named Beaumont, who knew Crow by reputation and looked at Evelyn with the frank curiosity of someone encountering an unexpected variable. Beaumont said he'd deliver it. She believed him. The morning they prepared to go down, she stood in the cabin and looked at it. The organized shelves, the sealed draft, the fixed window latch, the fire laid and banked to hold while they were gone, the second hook on the entry wall, the loft with its extra blanket, the tin of peppermint oil on the mantel. Crow came in from the barn, moving with increasing confidence on the crutch. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "We'll be back," he said. "I know. The cabin will hold, the horses are fed, everything's—" "I know, Gideon." She turned and looked at him. "I was just looking." He looked with her for a moment. At the fire, the shelves, the 2 chairs at the table that had started as one man's furniture and had become, in 4 months, something else entirely. "It looks different than it did in November," he said. "Everything does," she said. He thought about this. "Better," he said. "It looks better." She picked up her canvas bag, the same one she'd arrived with, heavier now, with things added to it, her mother's comb still in the inside pocket, the seeds still in their cloth wrapping, winter stored and patient. She put her coat on and went to hold the door. He came through it, into the winter light, and she followed, and she pulled the door closed behind them on the cabin that had become, without ceremony or announcement, the first place in her life that was genuinely hers. The trail down was clear. The trees were still and the cold was sharp, and a raven called somewhere above the rock face, and the gray horse moved forward with the reliable intention of an animal that knows where home is and is heading there, carrying a man with a broken leg and a repaired heart, and 11 years of closed-off life that had cracked open, finally, because a woman with rope burns on her wrists had decided to stay. She rode behind him on the bay mare, and she did not look back. The doctor in Deadwood Creek was a man named Horace Fell, who had come west from Philadelphia 12 years ago with a medical bag and a wife who lasted 2 winters before deciding she preferred civilization. Fell had stayed partly because the territory needed him, and partly because he'd discovered he had no particular appetite for going back to a place where everything reminded him of the person he'd been before. Evelyn understood this about him immediately, in the way she had come to understand certain things about certain people, the ones who had come to hard country looking for a fresh ledger. Fell set the leg properly, which involved a procedure she waited outside for, standing in the cold street in front of his office and listening to the sounds from inside, and telling herself that competent men doing necessary things was not something to be frightened of. When it was over and she went in, Crow was gray-faced on the cot but steady, and Fell was washing his hands and saying something about 6 weeks on the crutch, no exceptions, in the tone of a man who knows his instructions will be followed incompletely and is accounting for this in his delivery. "He's going to try to do things at 4 weeks, Evelyn said. "I know he is." Fell dried his hands. "That's why I said 6. It buys me the 2 weeks of arguing." He looked at her over his glasses, a direct, assessing look that reminded her of a different kind of man she had met in a courthouse several months back. "You splinted that yourself?" "Yes. It was a reasonable job. Kept the bone from moving." A pause. "Where did you learn to do that?" "A book," she said. "Your book, actually. The one on the shelf at the cabin." She paused. "I hope that was all right." Fell looked mildly startled. "That book's been up there since I lent it to Margaret Crow 4 years ago. I'd given up on seeing it again." He glanced at Crow, who was looking at the ceiling, then back at her. "You can keep it." They stayed in Deadwood Creek for 3 days while the leg stabilized and the trail was confirmed passable. Evelyn had not been back to town since the courthouse, and the experience of walking its streets again was stranger than she'd expected. Not frightening, exactly, but layered in a way she hadn't anticipated. Main Street looked the same. The courthouse was still at the far end with its limp flag. Puddin's Dry Goods was still operating, the back room still existing in its state of open secret. People looked at her. She had expected this, and she was prepared for it, which is different from not being affected by it, but is enough to get through a street without showing anything you don't intend to show. She saw Martha Alcott outside the Mercantile, and Martha looked at her with the complicated expression of a woman who has not decided yet which version of events she is going to land on, and Evelyn nodded to her as she would nod to any acquaintance and kept walking. She was not going to perform either bitterness or forgiveness for an audience. What she felt about Deadwood Creek and what it had done was her own business. She went to the mercantile and bought provisions, more than they'd left with, accounting for the weeks of recovery ahead, and she bought a length of good wool fabric because she had a coat to make, and winter wasn't done yet. She bought writing paper and a new pen because she had letters to write, and she intended to start them before they left town. She ran into Everett Crane on the way out. He was coming out of the land office next door, and he stopped when he saw her, with the specific startlement of a man who has been privately hoping not to have a particular encounter and is now having it. He was a small man, Crane, with the careful neatness of someone who uses orderliness as a substitute for authority, and standing on the street in the February light, he looked less official than he had behind his table. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Crane." A pause. He looked at her parcel and at her face, and down the street in the direction of Fell's office. "I heard Mr. Crow had an accident on the mountain," he said. "I'm glad he's recovering." "He is." Another pause. "I want you to know, the arrangement we recorded in November, the indenture document." He cleared his throat. "It was legal. But I want you to know it wasn't my intention to—" He stopped. Started again. "I've thought about it since." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a man who had done a thing inside a legal framework and was now standing outside that framework in the ordinary daylight and finding it didn't look the same. "I know you've thought about it," she said. "So have I." She shifted the parcel to her other arm. "I'm all right, Mr. Crane, in case that was what you wanted to know." He nodded, visibly relieved in the way of a man who has been worrying about something and has been given permission to stop. She walked back to Fell's office without looking back. She wrote 2 letters that evening at the small desk in the room they'd taken at the town's one boarding house. The first was to a woman named Clara Hooper in Cheyenne, a dressmaker she'd heard about from the wife of the trapper Beaumont, who had apparently produced a coat so well constructed that it was still in service after 7 winters. She wrote asking about techniques, about materials, about the particular challenges of high country cold. It was the kind of letter you write when you are deciding to stop treating your knowledge as accidental and start building it deliberately. She sealed it and set it aside. The second letter took longer. She sat with the paper in front of her for a while before she started it. She wrote to Harlan, not because she had forgiven him. She was still working on that, and she suspected she would be working on it for some time, because forgiveness is not a decision so much as a long, uneven process that you have to keep choosing even when you don't want to. She wrote because she had spent the ride down the mountain thinking about what she carried and what she was going to keep carrying and what she was going to set down, and Harlan fell in the last category. Not because he deserved the letter, because she needed to write it. She told him she was alive and well. She told him she was living on the mountain and that she intended to stay. She told him she was not angry, which was not entirely true but was truer than it had been in November, and she figured truth was a direction you traveled rather than a place you arrived. She told him that she hoped he found his way to something better, and that she meant this, imperfectly, in the way she could mean it. She did not tell him she loved him. That would have been dishonest. She sealed the letter and set it next to the one for Clara Hooper, and sat back in the chair and looked at the window, where the February night was pressing cold against the glass, and she felt something she recognized after a moment as lightness. The specific lightness of having put something down that you've been carrying so long, you stopped noticing the weight. Gideon told her that same evening that he wanted to talk about the arrangement. She had come back to the room with the letters written and the parcel stowed and found him sitting on the edge of the cot, crutch beside him, in the attitude of a man who has been sitting with something in his head for a while and is ready to say it. "Which arrangement?" she said, taking her coat off. "The courthouse one." She turned and looked at him. "It's not—" He stopped, tried again. "It was never what I wanted it to be. A legal document. I signed it because it was the only thing available to do in that moment, but it's not—" He was looking at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the working hands of a man who had built and lost and built again. "I don't want you to be here because of a document someone made you part of without asking you first." She sat down on the chair across from him. "I know that," she said. "I want you to choose. Gideon, I've been choosing since November. I told you that in the first week. I know you did. He looked up. I want to ask you properly, not in a cabin in a storm, not while I'm using a crutch and owing you my life. I want to ask you when everything is. I know nothing is ever simple. I know that. But I want to ask you when it's as close to simple as it gets. She was quiet for a moment. Then ask me, she said. He looked at her. The lamp between them threw his face in warm light and shadow. And he was not a handsome man in any easy sense. And he was not a smooth man. And he could not give her the things that women in other lives got. A townhouse, a social position, a life where no one looked at you sideways when you walked down the street. He had a mountain cabin and scarred hands, and 11 years of grief he was still in the process of carrying more carefully. And he had a gray horse and a sourdough starter and a collection of books and the specific, painstaking, imperfect capacity to care for someone that he had been practicing on her since November. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of what I signed, because of what I want to sign. On your terms, in front of whoever you want present or nobody if you'd rather, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to be worth what you walked 2 miles into a blizzard for." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is still not a romantic speech," she said. "I told you I'm not—" "Yes," she said. He went quiet. "Yes," she said again, in case the first one hadn't landed. "I'll marry you. Not because of the courthouse, and not because of the blizzard, and not because of what either of us owes the other." She leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. "Because you cut a rope off my wrists without making it mean anything, except that the rope was wrong. Because you told me I could leave and helped me understand I didn't want to. Because you are, genuinely, honestly, the least romantic man I have ever met, and somehow that is its own kind of romantic to me. And I don't entirely understand that, but I've stopped trying to." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, just the final release of something that had been held for a very long time, like the last ice going out of a river in late spring, quiet and inevitable and completely changing the character of the thing. He reached across the space between them and took her hand in both of his. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The lamp burned, and the night pressed against the window, and downstairs in the boarding house someone was moving around in the kitchen, and it was ordinary and imperfect and entirely sufficient. Bus. They were married 6 days later on a Sunday, in the small mountain chapel at the edge of Deadwood Creek, a weathered building with 12 pews and a wood stove that had been fighting a losing battle with the February cold since approximately its installation. Horace Fell stood as witness on one side. Beaumont the trapper, who had appeared in town for reasons he described as coincidental and which Evelyn suspected were nothing of the kind, stood on the other. The minister was a quiet man named Albright, who had the sensible quality of someone who understood that the people in front of him had not come for ceremony, but for the thing ceremony pointed at, and who kept it short and plain and true. Evelyn wore her own dress, the best one she had, the dark blue wool she'd been saving since she didn't know when. And she had her mother's silver comb in her hair, which was the one piece of vanity she permitted herself, and which felt, wearing it in this place on this day, like a conversation with someone she'd been missing for 20 years. Gideon wore his good shirt, which she had mended in the cabin in December, and which fit him now as it was meant to. He stood at the front of the chapel on his crutch, with the specific stillness of a man who has decided something completely and is entirely at peace with the decision. And when she walked down the aisle between the 12 empty pews, they had not told the town, and did not want the town. He looked at her the way she had once described to herself as what she needed from him. Not protecting, looking, fully, directly, like she was exactly what she was, and that was exactly right. She took his hand. They said what needed to be said. Outside after, in the thin February sunlight, Beaumont produced a bottle from somewhere inside his coat and poured 4 measures into 4 tin cups, and said to Surviving, in an echo of a toast she'd made herself some months back and which she had not shared with him, which meant that Gideon had, which meant something she felt down in the warm center of her chest. To Surviving, she said. They drank. Even Horace Fell drank, though he made the face of a man who had expected better. Spring came slowly, the way it always comes to high country. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in negotiations. A day of warmth followed by 3 of cold. the snow receding from the south-facing slopes first, the north-facing slopes holding out until May, the creek coming back loud and fast with meltwater, the first mud, which was its own kind of misery and its own kind of promise. The leg healed, not on Fell's timetable and not on Crow's preferred timetable, which was about 2 weeks faster than was advisable, somewhere in between, which Evelyn considered a reasonable compromise. By April, he was walking without the crutch, with a slight hitch in his gait that Fell said might ease over time or might not, and which Crow received with the flat pragmatism of a man who has recalibrated what he considers acceptable loss. She planted the kitchen garden in May. She had been planning it all winter, knew every bed by heart, knew what she wanted where, had thought about the light and the drainage and the particular soil of that clearing in the way she'd been thinking about soil and growing things her whole life without ever quite having a place that was her own to apply it to. She planted the seeds she'd carried in the cloth wrapping since October. The heirloom tomato seeds she'd been saving for 3 years, the squash she'd selected for cold hardiness, the bean variety her Aunt Clara had given her cuttings from when she was 12 years old, and which she had managed to keep going through every disruption since. Gideon helped with the heavier beds. He was not a natural gardener. His relationship with growing things was practical in the way of a man who understood agriculture as a survival mechanism rather than a craft. But he worked alongside her without needing things explained twice, and with the focused attention he brought to everything, and by the end of the first week the beds were turned and planted in hers. "You keep looking at it," he said one evening from the porch steps. She was standing at the garden edge in the late light, her hands dirty, looking at the turned beds. "I've never had a garden that was actually mine," she said. "I've planted things for other people my whole life." He was quiet for a moment. "What does it feel like?" She thought about it honestly. "Terrifying," she said. "And good, both at the same time." He nodded like he understood this exactly, which she thought he did. Their first child was born the following February, a girl which neither of them had predicted or planned for in any meaningful way, and which arrived with the chaotic, necessary urgency of things that cannot be controlled. Horace Fell came up the mountain for it, which he complained about at length and which she was profoundly grateful for. The labor was long. It was not the worst thing she had done. 2 miles up a mountain in a blizzard was still the worst thing she had done, but it was close. They named her Clara, which Gideon accepted without comment, and Evelyn cried about once, alone, standing over the sleeping baby in the new small room they'd built onto the east wall of the cabin in November, crying not from grief, but from the specific complexity of honoring what you've lost in the thing you've gained. Clara was a solid child with her mother's stubbornness and her father's stillness, a combination that produced a person who, from approximately 18 months, regarded the world with an assessing tranquility and then did exactly what she'd decided to do, regardless of anyone's opinion. Evelyn recognized this quality and found it both exhausting and deeply vindicating. 2 years after Clara came a boy they named James, who was the opposite in almost every respect, loud, mobile, interested in everything, perpetually in the process of having gotten into something. He had Gideon's hands, the same wide, square shape, and he used them on everything he encountered, which was a quality that broke 3 things in the first year and fixed 2 others by accident. The cabin grew, not quickly, not expensively. They were not rich people, and the mountain didn't produce wealth, so much as it produced the conditions for a life lived deliberately. Gideon added a room one summer, then a covered porch on the east side the next, then a better barn the year after, with a real hayloft and drainage that didn't flood in spring. Evelyn expanded the garden every year until it was a serious operation, selling preserves to the trading post in Deadwood Creek, teaching the children to put up vegetables in autumn, developing over time a knowledge of high-altitude growing that drew occasional questions from people as far as 2 counties away. The jars in the woodshed, Margaret's jars, with the looping feminine handwriting, stayed where they were for 2 more years. One spring morning, Evelyn went out to the shed and took them down one by one and looked at each label, and then she took them inside and put them on the kitchen shelf with the others. She did not replace the labels. She left Margaret's handwriting on them, because the woman who had made them had lived in that cabin and loved that man and died in a fire that wasn't fair, and her handwriting had as much right to be on those shelves as anyone's. She told Gideon what she'd done. He went and looked at the shelf for a while without speaking. "Is that all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. He touched one of the jars lightly, the berry jam. "She would have—" He stopped. "She would have liked you," he said. She had no patience for people who couldn't make decisions. "I'll take that," Evelyn said. He put his arm around her, which he did more easily now than he had in those early months. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, and he never would be. But he had learned the language of small physical presences, had learned that a hand on a shoulder or a head rested briefly on a head was its own kind of communication, and he used it now with a naturalness that had taken 2 years to develop, and which she valued precisely because it had cost him something. The years organized themselves into a life. That is the only way she could have put it, looking back. Not a story with a clean arc, not a trajectory from bad to good. A life, which meant it had years of plenty and years of difficulty, and a bad winter when the cattle they'd acquired were lost to sickness, and a good summer when the garden produced so abundantly she was giving things away in town for a month. It meant Clara at 9 developing a passion for the horses that surpassed even Gideon's, and which he cultivated with a fierce, quiet pride that made Evelyn's chest ache in the best way. It meant James at 7 breaking his arm falling out of the aspen tree she'd told him not to climb, and which he had known since he was 4 he was inevitably going to climb, and carrying him down the mountain and watching Fell set it with the same clinical efficiency he'd applied to Gideon's leg years earlier, and James announcing afterward that it had not hurt very much, which was an obvious lie delivered with magnificent conviction. It meant arguments, real ones, not the careful negotiations of people who are still learning each other, but the flat-out disagreements of two people who know each other well enough to be genuinely frustrated by the other's position. They argued about the fence line expansion. She thought further. He thought a smaller increment was more manageable, and they were both right and both wrong. And it took 3 weeks to resolve. They argued about whether James should be sent to the school in Deadwood Creek, which Evelyn wanted and Gideon resisted with the instinctive wariness of a man who had kept the world at arm's length for years and still felt its reach as a threat. She won that argument. She won it not by being louder or more persistent, but by being correct, which was the way she preferred to win things. She went into Deadwood Creek regularly now, not with the cautious, braced quality of that first return, but with the ordinary purposefulness of a woman who has business in town and is going to conduct it. The town had made its adjustments. People who had stood in the courthouse that November and done nothing had made their various peace with that fact in their various ways, and she was not going to help them with that process, and she was not going to punish them for it. She was simply going to be there, living her life in their proximity, which was either a reproach or an absolution depending on what they needed it to be. Martha Alcott stopped her on the street one afternoon, 4 years after the courthouse, with the purposeful air of a woman who has rehearsed something. "I want you to know," Martha said, "that I've thought about what happened in the courthouse." "I know," Evelyn said. "I should have—" "Martha." She looked at the woman, older now, a little thinner, with the look of someone who has been carrying something they want to set down. "I'm all right. I have been for a while. I just want you to know I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Thought about a courthouse in November with rope on her wrists, thought about the specific weight of public indifference and what it does to a person over time if they let it define them. "I know you are," she said, "and I mean it when I say I'm all right." She put her hand briefly on Martha's arm. "Buy some of my preserves. They're better than anything in the mercantile." Martha laughed, startled, genuinely amused, and they went into the store together, and it was not the erasure of anything that had happened, and it was not simple, but it was the beginning of something that wasn't weighted the way it had been, and that was enough. It was a September evening, many years later, and the children were grown. Clara had the horses now, a proper operation, breeding and training stock for the ranches in the valley, a business she had built with the same assessing tranquility she'd regarded the world with since she could walk. She had married a quiet man from Montana named Devereaux, who treated her like a person who made decisions, which was all Evelyn had ever hoped for anyone she loved. James was in Cheyenne studying law, sending letters home that grew progressively more articulate and increasingly expensive in their requests for additional funds, which Evelyn answered with money and opinions in roughly equal measure. The homestead had become something that needed a larger word than cabin. The main structure had been added to enough times that it was now a proper house, Not grand, but real, with a kitchen that had room to work in and a sitting room where the books had multiplied over the years to cover 2 full walls and a bedroom for the grandchildren when they visited. The garden was the size of the original clearing. The barn was a serious building. There were beehives along the south fence line. There was a second smaller cabin 50 yards east that they rented to a young couple who had come up the mountain looking for land the previous spring and who reminded Evelyn, in certain lights, of 2 people she had known at the beginning of things. She and Gideon walked up to the flat rock that evening, the one she'd named for herself in that first winter. It was a half-mile above the homestead on the southern slope, a broad shelf of granite that looked out over the valley below and the ridge above. And they had been coming here, every autumn, for more years than she could immediately count. It was their tradition in the unsentimental sense that things become traditions. Not because anyone declared them so, but because they kept happening, and each time they happened, it felt like something that should keep happening. Gideon was slower on the climb than he used to be. The leg had never been quite what it was before the pine tree, and the years had added to it in the ordinary way of years. He didn't complain. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who has learned to be honest with his body without being defeated by it, and when they got to the flat rock, he sat down with the exhale of someone setting down a weight they're glad to set down. She sat beside him. The valley below was the golden rust of September, the aspens gone to yellow, the meadows drying down to their autumn colors. The sky was going amber at the western edge and deeply blue above, the kind of sky you only get in high country in September, and she looked at it the way she had looked at things her whole life. With attention, with the specific pleasure of someone who never quite stopped being surprised that beauty was available to her. "You're quiet," he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" She thought about how to say it honestly. "About the courthouse," she said. "I think about it sometimes still, not the way I used to, not with the weight of it. More like, I take it out and look at it." She paused. "I used to think that day was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And now? Now I think it was just a day. A terrible, humiliating day that led, in a very crooked line, to here." She gestured at the valley, the sky, the homestead below with its smoke rising thin and straight in the still air. "And I don't know how to feel about that exactly. I don't think I'm supposed to be grateful for it, but I can see it differently than I could." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. "What I know," he said, "is that the people who were in that room, the ones who decided what you were worth, they were wrong. Not just about you, about what worth is. You can't see it from the outside. You can't see it from an hour in a courthouse." He turned and looked at her. "You find it out over time, in how a person lives, what they build, what they hold." She looked at him. This man with the weathered face and the gray hair and the slight hitch in his step, and the hands that were still scarred, still capable, that had held her face in a lamp-lit boarding house and asked her to choose. She thought about all the iterations of him she had known. The closed, careful man in the doorway of a courthouse. The man who cut a rope and said 4 words and walked her out of something. The man she had found under a pine tree in a blizzard and dragged back to life. The man who was terrible at romantic speeches and who kept a sourdough starter alive for 8 years and who had learned, imperfectly and stubbornly and without grace, to let someone stay. "You never said that to me before," she said. "Not in so many words." "I thought it plenty." "That is very like you," she said. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had first seen in a courthouse in November, all those years ago, that hadn't quite made it to the surface. It made it now, full, unhurried, real. The face of a man who had stopped being surprised that he had things worth smiling about. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat on the flat rock in the September light and looked at the valley below and the homestead they had built from nothing. From 2 people who had been convinced by various loud voices that they were worth very little, learning slowly and with difficulty to believe otherwise. This is the thing about worth, the true thing that no courthouse and no gambling debt and no winter storm can finally settle. It is not assigned. It is not bid on, or signed over, or granted by the approval of people who happened to be in the room the day you needed someone to stand up. It lives in the accumulated evidence of a life, in gardens planted, in splints fashioned from fence boards in a blizzard, in letters written to people you are still working on forgiving, and sourdough starters kept alive on a shelf for 8 years by a man who wasn't sure he deserved to eat what they made, and children who look at the world with steadiness and go out into it anyway. Evelyn Mercer had been told, at 23, standing in a public room with rope on her wrists, that she was worth nothing. The town of Deadwood Creek had reached its verdict, and the gavel had come down, and that had seemed, in that terrible hour, like something permanent. It was not permanent. It was 1 hour, in one room, among people who were afraid of what they didn't know and who measured things with the wrong instruments. They were not evil. They were not even exceptional in their failure. They were simply the loudest voices in the room at a moment when she had not yet found her own. The frightened young woman, who was traded away for nothing, had become, quietly, crookedly, through hard winters and a broken leg and a garden and 2 children and a man with scarred hands who had needed her stubbornness as much as she had needed his steadiness. Someone she did not recognize from that courthouse platform. Not because she had been rescued, because she had kept going when there was no clear reason to, and in the keeping going had built something the courthouse could never have imagined. The sun went down behind the ridge. The valley went soft in the evening light. Below them, in the homestead they had built together, a lamp came on in the kitchen window. Claire's daughter, 9 years old, who had taken to heart every woman in her family and from whom Evelyn expected considerable things. "We should go down," Gideon said. "It's getting cold." "I know." She didn't move immediately, just a moment longer, looking at the lamp in the window and the valley and the sky. "Evelyn, I'm coming." She stood, and he stood, and she took his hand because she wanted to, and because she could, and because after all these years, the simple fact of it still meant something. 2 people choosing each other in the ordinary moment, the unwitnessed moment, the moment with no rope, and no courthouse, and no blizzard. Just a flat rock and the last light and the long walk home. They went down together, not carefully, not perfectly, moving through the September dusk the way people move when they know the ground and trust their feet and are not afraid of the dark that's coming because they have been in the dark before and they know what it leads to. They went home.